Actor Alec Baldwin and armorer Hannah Gutierrez-Reed have been officially charged by the Santa Fe County DA. Wait a minute. No, they're going to be charged. Wait, have they been charged or have they not been charged yet? The reporting on this has been admittedly confusing. But this confusion just might be an indication of some very interesting things happening behind the scenes at the Santa Fe County DA, which we'll get into in this video. But also with these expected charges, there has been a debate going on about whether or not it's a good idea to criminally charge an actor on a movie set for a firearm mishap. Do we expect actors to become gun experts now? How does this change movie making? To get into that, we're going to talk about what happened, what the charges are, and what kind of evidence has come out about this case. And at the end of the video, I want to hear what you have to say about all of this, so be sure to weigh in the comments below. Let's get into it. Okay, so to make sure that we all have the same information in front of us, let's talk about everything that's come out about the fatal incident and what led up to it. On October 21st, 2021, Alec Baldwin was inside a small church on set for the indie film Rust on the Bonanza Creek Ranch in New Mexico. The film, a Western about a man on the run from the law after freeing his grandson from imprisonment and certain death, was in its 12th day of shooting, around halfway through the project. In this moment, Baldwin was reportedly rehearsing a scene inside the church which involved him drawing a revolver, aiming it, and pulling back the hammer.
This is a marking rehearsal where I'm going to show her. She's standing next to the camera. She's like this. You're me. She's got a monitor here. The camera is here filming that way. She takes a monitor that is his monitor, the operator, and turns it toward her. It swivels, and she says to me, hold the gun lower. Go to your right. Okay, right there. All right, do that. Now show it a little bit lower. And she's getting me to position the gun. Everything is in her direction.
And then tragedy struck. While rehearsing it with the cinematographer Halyna Hutchins, who was standing at the camera's monitor to set up the shot, the revolver went off.
So you have this Colt 45, you just pulled.
The hammer as far back as I could without cocking the actual
And you're
gun.
holding onto the hammer.
I'm holding that. I'm just showing. I go, how about that? Does that work? Do you see that? Do you see that? Do you see that? She goes, yeah, that's good. I let go of the hammer. Bang, the gun goes off.
The round inside the revolver went through Hutchins and into the shoulder of director Joel Souza. Hutchins was killed and Souza was hospitalized, but later recovered from his injury. Obviously, death and serious injury isn't supposed to happen on any film set. So instantly, questions came up about what exactly happened on set. Did he pull the trigger? Did the gun malfunction? Why was Baldwin pointing the gun at Hutchins? How did a live round make it into the gun? What kind of safety measures were in place on this set? Over time, more information started to leak about the conditions on set and what led up to this fatal incident. First off, apparently Baldwin served not only as the actor in the leading role, but also as a producer, specifically for aid in creative decisions related to script and advertising for the movie. His position as a producer is potentially important, but it is noteworthy that his producer role apparently did not entail hiring or managing crew or the budget of the film, but it did mean that he arguably had a certain level of power on set, in addition to him being Alec freaking Baldwin, a legendary A-list actor who's been in Hollywood starring in movies for decades. That might be important in this case. Second, relatively speaking, Rust was a low-budget film, and there are reports from people on set who say that there were corners being cut all over the place, including regarding safety. It was so bad that 6 camera crew workers walked off set hours before Hutchins was shot. According to the LA Times, several people reported that safety protocols standard in the industry, including gun inspections, were not strictly followed on the Rust set. And at least one of the camera operators complained the weekend before to a production manager about gun safety issues. 3 crew members on set apparently said that they were particularly concerned about 2 accidental prop gun charges, one of which was when Baldwin's stunt double accidentally fired 2 rounds the prior Saturday after being told that the gun was quote-unquote cold, or in other words, safe. According to a crew member, there should have been an investigation into what happened. Instead, there were no safety meetings. There was no assurance that it wouldn't happen again. All they wanted to do was rush, rush, rush. One of them was apparently so alarmed by the prop gun misfires that he sent a text message to the unit production manager saying, "We've now had 3 accidental discharges. This is super unsafe." On top of that, Gutierrez-Reed was apparently working multiple roles on the set at the same time, which split her focus arguably away from her duties as the armorer. As a result, things were apparently a disorganized mess, including the labeling of different types of rounds in the prop department. Hannah Gutierrez-Reed herself has described the Rust production set in legal filings as a quote-unquote perfect storm of factors, basically saying that it was essentially inevitable that an incident like this would have happened based on the way that the production company was running things. But now, what about the gun in Baldwin's hand? What happened there? First, there have been some conflicting statements as to who handed the gun to whom. When Baldwin initially spoke to the police, notably without the presence of an attorney and after having been Mirandized, he at first said that it was Gutierrez-Reed who handed him the gun before this rehearsal. He was pretty unequivocal about it too.
What about the armorer though? Or was she?
She's outside.
Okay.
She comes in. She hands me the gun all the time.
And then what?
If there's any shooting involved in the scene, she always hands me the gun.
Never has Dave handed you the gun?
Never.
Okay. And then she goes back outside?
She waits outside because she just can't be there sitting there when see. Sometimes in the scenes there's reflections, like, you see. So you only need the necessary crew in there for shooting the camera.
But then in another conversation, he said that it was the assistant director, David Halls, who handed him the gun before this rehearsal.
Why did Halls take the gun off the cart and hand me the gun? Why, in that instance? Why?
And
he must have a reason why. Why?
did you see him take it off the cart?
I'm told the other women told me he took it off. I think he said he took it off the cart.
Okay.
I think he testified that he took it off the cart, but all I know is that it's very rare that Halls hands me the gun on the set, and this time he did. He handed me the gun.
He later confirmed this version in an interview with George Stephanopoulos of ABC.
I'm handed a gun, and someone declares, they said, this is a cold gun.
Dave Halls.
The first AD. In my years on the sets of film, hot gun meant that there was a charge in there, and cold gun meant there was nothing in there.
And according to reports about the initial warrant in this case, David Halls admitted to the authorities that Gutierrez-Reed handed him the gun, and he handed it to Baldwin without checking it himself, telling Baldwin it was quote-unquote cold. Notably, this was a departure from what was apparently supposed to happen. By all accounts, from everyone involved here, Gutierrez-Reed was supposed to check the gun, make sure that it's safe, and then be the sole person to hand it over to Baldwin for any scene or any rehearsal for a scene. And then, according to Baldwin at least, at the end of a scene, he was supposed to hand it off back to Gutierrez-Reed, or if she wasn't around, then to David Halls.
I don't mean to tell you your business, but an important question for Halls is, why did you take the gun off the cart and hand it to Alec when Alec's testimony is that 99% of the time, Hannah would present him with the gun. He may hand you the gun when they're done. Hannah would hand me the gun, and after we're done with the scene, whether there was shooting involved or not, I have been trained as an actor to hand the gun off to the prop master or armorer. That's a new phrase for me. I haven't heard that phrase in a while. The prop master or the first AD. That's what I was trained to do. The minute they say cut, you hand off the gun.
Now, it's clear that Gutierrez-Reed was supposed to check the gun. She is the armorer, and as the armorer, that falls within her duties. But anyone else beyond that is kind of currently being debated. We'll touch more on that argument in a bit. But for now, just know that apparently no one checked the gun to make sure that it was safe before this rehearsal started. Okay, so before we get into this debate about what Alec Baldwin should or shouldn't have done, we first need to know exactly what the charges are that we're looking at here. Based on what's being reported, here's what we know. First, David Halls has apparently taken a plea deal for negligent handling of a firearm. As a result, he's getting 6 months probation and a suspended sentence, the length of which is unclear based on the reporting that I've seen anyway. But regardless, probably the most important part here is the fact that he's likely cooperating with the authorities as part of this deal, and that now his threat of incrimination is gone, meaning that he can be compelled to testify in trial without invoking any Fifth Amendment right. Next, we have the two people who are set to be charged, Alec Baldwin and Hannah Gutierrez-Reed. They both are reportedly set to be charged with the same thing, 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter each. And I'll admit, the reporting on these details has not exactly been great, partially due to the fact that the Santa Fe County DA hasn't actually officially charged Baldwin or Gutierrez-Reed yet. So we kind of need to piece things together to figure out exactly what these charges are expected to be. CNBC reports that one of the involuntary manslaughter counts is one in which prosecutors will have to prove there is underlying negligence. The second involuntary manslaughter charge is apparently one for the commission of a lawful act, a more severe charge which requires proof that there was more than simple negligence involved in the death. Okay, so they specify that one is for a lawful act and the other involves underlying negligence. What are we talking about here? Let's first look to what New Mexico law says about involuntary manslaughter. According to the New Mexico statutes, manslaughter is where the defendant kills a human being without malice. In other words, without actually having any specific intent to kill the person. Involuntary manslaughter is manslaughter that happens when the defendant is either engaging in a non-felony unlawful act or when the defendant is engaging in a lawful act which might produce death in an unlawful manner or without due cause and circumspection. So when this article says that one of the charges is for a lawful act, it sounds like they're suggesting that the other one is for an unlawful act, the first part of this definition. And after looking at some case law and looking again at the New Mexico statutes, it looks like the unlawful act we're talking about is negligent use of a deadly weapon, which is what it appears David Halls pled guilty to. So putting that all together, we can actually go through the elements of each charge. Charge number 1 is basically where Baldwin or Gutierrez-Reed killed Hutchins while engaged in an unlawful act, specifically handling a firearm in a negligent manner. Negligence is where someone has failed to behave with the level of care that someone with ordinary prudence would have exercised under the same circumstances. Looking at Baldwin's case, this asks how careful was he in handling the revolver during the rehearsal? Was he as careful as he should have been under these circumstances? One thing to note is that the defendant's subjective knowledge and experience in these kinds of circumstances becomes a factor in this analysis. If someone is an expert in a particular field, for example, they're going to be held to a higher standard because we as a society should be able to expect more from people like that. In Baldwin's case, despite the fact that he's long been very vocal about his dislike of guns in the realm of politics, he has been around them since childhood. According to his autobiography, nevertheless, his father was a riflery coach and a teacher at a local high school. And Baldwin suggests in the autobiography that his father may have died because he spent decades in an unventilated shooting range that had lead dust in the air. Dust that was inhaled for over 25 years, not just by his father, but also by his brothers and himself.
An oncology resident from India asked, "Did your father ever work in heavy industry?" "No," I said. "Near a steel mill or factories?" "No," I said. "Your father has a very high lead content in his blood," he informed me. I told the doctor that my father had coached riflery in a high school for 28 years, and he ventured that an unventilated shooting range may have been a cause. There, for over a quarter of a century, lead dust was inhaled, not just by my dad, but by his team members and my brothers and me as well.
Of course, just because Baldwin says that he spent time in a shooting range doesn't mean that he was actively shooting any firearms at the range. It is important to recognize that. It's also important to note that during that time period, Baldwin doesn't say how often he was at that range. But it does suggest, at the very least, an early familiarity with firearms stemming from his childhood. But of course, that's not talking about specifically firearms on a movie set. And yes, where the defendant is going to be compared to a reasonable person under the same circumstances, a difference can sometimes be drawn based on the context of where the incident occurred. For example, on a movie set or elsewhere. But that distinction isn't always going to be drawn. A strong argument still can be made that any person who is handling a firearm should be held to the same standard because that same element of danger is there nonetheless. But even if we were to assume that actors on a movie set have their own standard for firearms, there are places to look for guidance as to these standards. First, the Screen Actors Guild, a union which Baldwin is very much a member of, has long had a fairly clear policy on guns on set accessible through its website. According to Safety Bulletin Number 1, which has been in effect since 2009, the policy says blanks can kill. Treat all firearms as though they are loaded. And in the same bulletin, it goes over the general safe use and handling of firearms. In the very first point, it says, refrain from pointing a firearm at anyone, including yourself. If it is absolutely necessary to do so on camera, consult the property master or other safety representative, such as the first assistant director / stage manager. Remember that any object at which you point a firearm could be destroyed. From what Baldwin has said, when he was rehearsing, pointing the gun and pulling back the hammer, he was following the instructions of Halyna Hutchins, a cinematographer.
Getting me to position the gun, everything is in her direction.
Nowhere has he mentioned that any safety representative was supervising this activity when he was pointing the gun and pulling back the hammer. But okay, looking at this policy, I can't see where it says anything about whether or not an actor should be responsible for checking the gun before a scene or before rehearsal. So let's put that policy to the side for a moment. We're still talking about Alec Baldwin, who's been in movies for over 40 years, many of which have involved firearms. So what does Baldwin say is the proper standard?
Why did you choose in your 40 years not to check the gun yourself?
What I was taught by someone years ago was, as I said, if I took a gun and I popped a clip out of a gun or I manipulated the chamber of a gun, they would take the gun away from me and redo it. The prop person said, don't do that, when I was young. And they'd say, one thing you would need to understand is we don't want the actor to be the last line of defense against a catastrophic breach of safety with the gun. My job, they told me, man or woman, my job is to make sure the gun is safe, and then I hand you the gun and I declare the gun safe.
And this was from the beginning of your career?
From day one.
Okay, so he says he's had the same standard since he was first taught in the industry. That hasn't changed. But then he says this.
What is the actor's responsibility?
I guess that's a tough question because the actor's responsibility going this day forward is very different than it was the day before that. Yeah.
Wait a minute. I think he may have just made a big mistake here. He just indicated that he's had the same unchanging personal standard for his entire career.
And this was from the beginning of your career?
From day one.
But then he showed that he recognizes that well-known on-set tragedies involving firearms can change the standard for everyone. But there have already been well-known on-set tragedies involving firearms, most notably the death of Brandon Lee on set the movie The Crow. And importantly, not long after the Rust shooting happened, A-list actor George Clooney was on the WTF with Mark Maron podcast. There, he said that the standard for actors to check a gun on a movie set is not only clear, but has been clear ever since the death of Brandon Lee. Specifically, here's what he said.
You know, I've been on sets for 40 years, and the person that hands you the gun, the person that is responsible for the gun is either the prop person or the armor, period.
Yeah.
And, you know, and this is one of those things. I was friends with an actor named John Eric Hexum who accidentally pulled a gun up with a blanket and put it to his head and died from the concussion. And then I was really good friends with Brandon Lee. And that was a series of stupid things that happened. When I say stupid, I mean, you know, low budget film. I think they were in North Carolina. You know, my cousin Miguel was going to be his best man the next week at their wedding, you know.
Miguel Ferrar? Is that
Miguel.
who that is? Yeah.
And Brandon and I played ball and hung out at the Hollywood Y 3 days a week. We were buddies. And, you know, this was his big break. And the first unit, low budget, probably, I don't remember if the guy was even a union prop guy, sent it down to the second unit, a different group of shooting, and they wanted to use the same gun. So they sent the gun down there. It was the guy's girlfriend that was the prop assistant. They didn't have dummy bullets, so they made them by taking the gunpowder out and putting the bullet back in. They did a close-up of the cylinder turning with the bullets going around. She takes out the bullets out of the cylinder, and one of the bullets had lodged in the barrel of the gun. And then they send it back up to first unit. No one checks the barrel. No one notices that of the 6 shells, one of them is missing the bullet, and hands it to the first unit. They put a full load in it. The actor, which you never do with a full load, points it directly at Brandon and pulls the trigger. And it's like getting shot with a normal bullet, and killed him, you know. And this one you look at, you say, now we're seeing, so it was dummy bullets. This is the problem, right? Now, every single time I'm handed a gun on a set, every time, Mark, they hand me a gun, I look at it, I open it, I show it to the person I'm pointing it to. We show it to the crew. Every single take, you hand it back to the armor when you're done. You do it again. And part of it is because of what happened to Brandon. Right. Everyone does it. Everybody knows. And maybe Alec did that. Hopefully he did do that.
At the same time, Santa Fe County DA Mary Carmack-Altwies said that one of her factors in deciding whether or not to charge the two defendants was in fact that she spoke to a number of actors, including some A-list actors, about what the industry standard really is on this issue. And she said according to those conversations, the standard is the actor is supposed to check the gun. Now, from what I've been able to see, she didn't name any specific names as to who she actually talked to. But in my opinion, if George Clooney was one of them, and if this case actually does proceed to trial, he could be a really damaging witness for Baldwin. Now, with all of that said, let's turn to the second charge. Charge number 2 is basically where Baldwin or Gutierrez-Reed killed Hutchins while engaged in a lawful act that might produce death, either in an unlawful manner or without due caution and circumspection. In New Mexico, for the state to win on a charge like this, they have to show criminal negligence. Criminal negligence is basically where someone engages in conduct that is reckless, wanton, or willful. In other words, in Baldwin's case, it basically has to be a situation where he knew he was creating a risk and disregarded that risk by continuing his conduct. So you can probably tell that this is going to be harder for the state to prove than the first charge, because you have to get inside the brain of the defendant, figure out what they knew, what they understood, and what they ignored. So what did Baldwin know subjectively about gun safety and the safety of these guns on this particular set going into that fatal rehearsal? We already went over some of what we understand about his general history with firearms from his childhood, but here's a clip from his interview with the police from that day on October 21st, 2021, after the incident, where he demonstrated his knowledge of firearms and the different types of firearm rounds.
Well, the flash round has a charge in here,
Okay.
of powder, different sizes. Like I said, quarter, half full load, and a wadding in there to pack it in. It's packed in tightly.
Okay.
So when you hit this pin, it explodes. Now, sometimes it has this material there if you have to have the cosmetic feature through the gun and then shoot. But often it has, there's the BBs in there. This is a dummy round. No dummy here, but there's that. My point is that very often when you give me, when she's loaded the gun with rounds for us to go hot and flash and shoot, they've had that creased, folded head. The dumpling head, as we say.
Okay.
They've almost never looked like this for the flash. Only when the camera sees inside the cylinder do you put those in there.
But those are both dummy rounds.
That's a dummy
To your-
round. That's a dummy round.
Interestingly, in the same interview, he also tells the police about when the production might set up a lucite or plexiglass screen for a take that involves pointing a gun at a camera.
If the director wants you to aim the gun at the camera, they put a lucite screen up there, and I shoot the gun at you, you can see the bullets inside there, or they can go to do that with a computer.
As far as we know, there were no lucite or plexiglass screens set up between Baldwin and Hutchins for this rehearsal. Now, another thing that we've talked about earlier in this video is the several misfires that apparently happened on set before this incident. We don't know for sure if Baldwin knew about those. He says that he didn't know about them until after the incident with Hutchins happened. But this is where David Hall's cooperation with the police could come in. As one of the safety representatives, Halls arguably would have had awareness of all of these misfirings. And if he hands over to the police communications written to Baldwin about these misfirings, that could be a very heavy factor in favor of the state for this second charge. And remember the 6 camera crew members who quit just hours before this incident? Well, they didn't just quit. They took with them a system of camera monitors that the production was using to minimize the density of people while filming a scene. The stated purpose was apparently to ensure that they were following all COVID-19 guidelines. But on a set with firearms, these monitors are also generally used when someone needs to fire a gun at the camera. A monitor off to the side allows the shot to be captured while making sure that all people operating or directing the camera are out of harm's way. So basically, going into this rehearsal scene, this is what Baldwin may have had in his head. He may have known about these several misfirings. He also did have awareness of the camera crew members quitting, taking with them these monitors. So he knew that there was no using these monitors to keep people out of the line of fire. He also would have been able to see that there was no lucite/plexiglass screen that was put up between him and anyone else that was in the line of fire of his gun when he was pointing it. He also says that he knew that Hannah Gutierrez-Reed was supposed to be the one to hand him the gun before this rehearsal, and that instead Halls was the one that handed it to him. Baldwin didn't check the gun, and he didn't see anyone else check the gun before this rehearsal either. So zeroing in on this moment, the moment that Halls offers Baldwin the gun to be used in this rehearsal, Baldwin is faced with a choice. He can either accept the gun or he can reject it. If he were some new young actor without any real voice or sway on set or in the industry, I could understand them being maybe afraid to say, I'm sorry, this is protocol. I don't feel safe here with how this is going on. Please do this differently. But this is Alec freaking Baldwin, an actor who has been in starring roles for literally decades and who was a producer on the film. Regardless of what kind of producer he was, he arguably had the power to reject the gun until the proper safety procedures had been followed and without fear of retaliation. So when Baldwin accepted the gun from Halls to proceed with that rehearsal, what do you think? Do you think that he knew that he was creating a risk by handling that gun? And if so, do you think that he disregarded that risk? Let us know in the comments down below. Now, to be fair to Baldwin, I want to bring up a couple areas of defense that might be available to him. Of course, the first is the idea that as a policy, as an industry standard, he as the actor in the scene shouldn't be held responsible for the gun's safety. But another defense comes from the medical examiner's autopsy report, specifically the medical examiner's conclusion as to the manner of Hutchins' death. When we're talking about manner of death, we're talking about something distinct from cause of death, which is the specific determination of why someone died. Manner of death, on the other hand, is a way of categorizing how someone died. Basically, there are 5 categories: natural death, accident, suicide, homicide, and undetermined. For this video, let's just focus on 2 of them: homicide and accident. Accidents are defined as an unnatural death resulting from an inadvertent chance happening. As an example, think of traffic-related fatalities. A homicide, on the other hand, is where the action of one person directly causes the death of another. If this goes to trial, this is bound to come up because the medical examiner determined that the manner of Hutchins' death was an accident, not a homicide. On its face, this does help Baldwin because it's essentially up to the state to convince the jury that the medical examiner doesn't make any legal determination when deciding the manner of death. And in fact, in the autopsy report, the medical examiner said that this was an accident because law enforcement reports showed no compelling demonstration that the firearm was intentionally loaded with live ammunition on set, and because there was an absence of obvious intent to cause harm or death. So while there is this absence of information, the DA arguably could find evidence and present evidence to the jury that fills that space. So while this arguably does help Baldwin, I don't think that it helps him all that much in a way that matters most. But there is another argument that he can make, and that's about the revolver itself. You see, Alec Baldwin, in his interview with George Stephanopoulos of ABC, said that he did not pull the trigger. He said that he pulled the hammer back, and when he let go of the hammer, the gun went off.
But we kept doing this, so then I said to her, now in this scene, I'm going to cock the gun. And I said, do you want to see that? And she said, yes. So I take the gun and I start to cock the gun. I'm not going to pull the trigger. I said, do you see that? She goes, well, just cheat it down and tilt it down a little bit like that. And I cock the gun. I go, can you see that? Can you see that? Can you see that? And she says, and then I let go of the hammer of the gun and the gun goes off. I let go of the hammer of the gun and the gun goes off.
At the moment, the decisive
That was the moment the gun went off, yeah. That was the moment the gun went off.
It wasn't in the script for the trigger to be pulled.
Well, the trigger wasn't pulled. I didn't pull the trigger.
So you never pulled the trigger?
No. I would never point a gun at anyone and pull a trigger at them, never.
Now, after this interview, this claim was pounced upon by firearms experts everywhere, talking about how this is just not possible with a working revolver of this type.
Not plausible. On a single action revolver, when you pull the hammer back, which is an intentional act, click, 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 click. Now the hammer is set. When you pull the hammer back and let go, as you can see, I'm not holding this, the hammer doesn't go anywhere. When you press the trigger, which is, I'm going to do it with this finger so you can see what a minute act that is. takes very little to press the trigger there. So option one, he pressed the trigger, but it was such a minor press that he wasn't aware that he had, ordered that signal from his brain. Or option B, he's holding the gun with the trigger depressed. Now, on this gun, it doesn't matter which order you go in. You can either cock the gun and you can fire it with the trigger, or you can press the trigger and then cock the gun. And if you release it at this point, it falls and the gun fires. So if, as he is cross-drawing, his finger is on the trigger, which he may have interpreted as just resting on the trigger, but with a 1 millimeter pull, that would be sufficient. Now he pulls the hammer back and then releases it. He doesn't have to press the trigger again if he's already got pressure on it in order for the gun to fire. And I think that's really a key point in this matter.
So the question then becomes, was there a malfunction in this gun? Enter the FBI lab report. The FBI tested the gun a number of different ways to see if it could fire with the hammer pulled back without pulling the trigger. And here's what they found. With the hammer at the quarter and half cock positions, the revolver in question could not be made to fire without a pull of the trigger. The same thing was true of the revolver when the hammer was in the full cock position. So this would appear to show that Baldwin would have had to pull the trigger for the revolver to shoot Hutchins. Maybe the trigger pull was very slight. This could have been a very sensitive trigger. But Baldwin's attorneys have already pointed to other details in this report to suggest the revolver was faulty and in poor condition. Specifically, they point to this part of the report that says, during this testing, portions of the trigger sear and cylinder stop fractured while the hammer was struck. The fracture of these internal components allowed the hammer to fall and the firing pin and detonated the primer. This was the only successful discharge during this testing, and it was attributed to the fracture of internal components, not the failure of the firearm or safety mechanisms. But then again, the FBI conclusions still stand. They say that the gun couldn't have gone off without that trigger somehow being pulled. But what do you think about the FBI report's findings? Let us know in the comments down below. Okay, so this is a lot of information to digest, but we still haven't really touched on the DA's funny practice of announcing that they will later have an announcement to make an announcement at a later date to eventually charge Alec Baldwin and Hannah Gutierrez-Reed with involuntary manslaughter. And it's kind of caused some confusion. So why don't they just go ahead and charge without making these prior announcements? Now, speculation alert here, because I am 100% theorizing. I don't have any kind of insider information as to what is going on at the Santa Fe County DA's office. But I do know that law often involves strategy just as much as it involves an analysis of the law and the facts. And it should be remembered that the DA quietly got a plea deal from David Halls prior to this announcement of these pending charges. So that leads me to wonder if maybe they're still trying to negotiate one or maybe even two plea deals out of these two defendants. Think about it. Baldwin and Gutierrez-Reed both have a clear picture of what is waiting for them by the end of the month. This gives them time to think about it and to talk to their legal counsel and to come up with a potential plan for what to do when these charges actually get filed. And that could involve their legal counsel picking up the phone and calling the Santa Fe County DA to talk about what kind of alternatives they may have here. Now, I don't know whether the state has a focus on trying one defendant over another, or whether they'd rather not go through the full expense and media circus that would come from trying a case like this in open court. But if they did have a single defendant in mind that they wanted to try, it would be a much stronger case if all of the other main defendants involved cooperated with the state through a plea deal. This way you don't have multiple cases pitted against one another, and it would mean that all of these other people are more likely to share evidence. And importantly, it would also mean that all of these people would no longer have any sort of criminality threat over their heads, which would mean that if they were compelled to testify at trial for one defendant, they wouldn't be able to invoke their Fifth Amendment rights. And that's an interesting thought. But what do you think? Was Baldwin properly charged here? Do you think that the state is actually going to follow through on charging both Baldwin and Gutierrez-Reed? If this goes to trial against Baldwin, do you think he could get convicted? Let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this, or at least found this interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more stuff like this and you haven't done so already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is uploaded. See you in the next video.